we're going to go right into our next panel from Young Jains of America. This is the YJA panel, Anekantavada, and Interreligious Dialogue in Everyday Life. And our presider for this is a very special guest who I mentioned yesterday several times, Rabbi Professor Alan Brill. He's one of the co-editors of the volume Jainism and Comparative Theology, a multi-religious approach, which we discussed in great detail yesterday. And he's with us today to preside over this panel. I'm so grateful. Thank you to Professor Alan Brill. He is the Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair for Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University, and I've seen him comment in so many ways so favorably about the Jain tradition and Dharma traditions, broadly speaking. So you're in good company, and I welcome you, Professor Brill, to preside over this panel. So it's about an hour for the talks, and then we have about 30 minutes for discussion at the end. Welcome, Professor Brill. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful start to the day. And the Anekantavada and interreligious dialogue in everyday life is this next panel, and it's featuring Young Jains of America. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then the question and answer will be the half an hour after all four speakers. Our first speaker is Ankith Desai, a Deconstructing Anekantavada as a front for injustice. And without further ado, we'll now turn to him.
Jai there, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Brill, and everyone here today for this presentation. My name is Ankith. I'm a master's student in Engaged Jain Studies at Claremont School of Theology and Arihanta Institute. Today, I'll be talking about deconstructing Anekantavada as a front for injustice. So I guess to start off, just defining the very basic, I think the most common ways of referring to Anekantavada: many pointedness, multiplicity of views, and non-absolutism. And for how it's taught within the Jain community, it often is with the story of five men or seven men I've even seen who are feeling different portions of an elephant and cannot see and are coming to different conclusions based off of that. And so with this idea of multiplicity of views, I wanted to kind of go through a few of the um, lived examples that I've experienced that kind of prompted me to work on this research and how Anekantavada is mentioned and invoked in the modern Jain community when it comes to social justice. So starting in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd and a nationwide discussion on systemic racism faced by the Black community, the Jain community was really faced with action or inaction in this time, whether to take a position against police brutality and other systems of violence and oppression against the Black community, especially in the United States, and as well as oppression and marginalization that was at the hands of the Jain community even and members of the Jain community. And when this discussion was going on, numerous times, Anekantavada was mentioned as why a Jain center or a Jain organization or just an informal Jain community should not discuss and not take a position on this issue because of the multiple views that existed at this time. In 2023, for the past many years, there has been a lot of movements of making Jain centers 100% vegan, also vegan initiatives within formal and informal Jain communities, Jain events. And there have been several instances where the opposition for vegan initiatives has been reasoned with Anekantavada as to respect dietary choices of members or attendees who may not be vegan. And so in this case, it was definitely brought up as an opposition to and shutting down certain vegan initiatives. Again, formal and informal within the Jain community. In 2024, when there was the 2024 presidential election, there was opposition to even public forums and civic education on the candidacies and relevancy to the Jain community of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. While several Jain organizations, centers, even informal social WhatsApp groups and different things sent out messages to encourage and remind their members to vote, there was no mention of any issue or values that Jains should keep in their mind when voting. So there, it was definitely a very neutral sort of messaging that the Jain community adopted. In 2025, following the Trump administration's immigration raids, Jain centers and organizations, when asked to comment about these threats and an inflection of violence on innocent communities, the popular response was to practice Anekantavada and not take a unilateral position on this issue. And I also even through this was able to conduct a little bit of a survey within the Jain community. And the methodology that I use, these are just two examples of a series of prompts that I offered. So one
Mm.
being should basically Jain centers and organizations should endorse political candidates and urge their members to vote for a certain candidate or political party during elections. And Jain centers and organizations should comment on political issues. And the first part of this survey was to simply answer with agreement or disagreement. So as you can see, the option choices for all of these prompts were the same, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then the second part of it was followed up with the exact same prompts, repeated, and respondents were asked to select which Jain value was most influential in their previous answer. And the ones that I did offer were Ahimsa, Anekantvad, Parigraha, and Satya. There was also another option where respondents could type any sort of other value that they may see fit or influential for their previous answer. So with the results, for the first prompt, that Jain centers and organizations should endorse political candidates and urge their members to vote for a certain candidate or political party during elections. 71%, a little bit over 71%, answered with disagreeing with that prompt. And again, this was simply just a opinion poll. There were no right or wrong answers or anything of that sort. What was interesting to see is that of the respondents of this prompt, 70% of those responses chose Anekantvat to be the most influencing principle for their stance of agreement or disagreement. The second prompt that I highlighted earlier, Jain centers and organizations should comment on political issues. Almost 78% disagreed with this idea. Again, this was just an opinion poll. And what was interesting is the value that really rose to the top was Anekantha, with 57% of respondents selecting Anekantha as the most influencing principle for their stance in it for this prompt. So when we talk about deconstruction, how can examples be dissected to understand a multiplicity of views playing a key role in debated issues of injustice? And so I'm going to look at three main ways of deconstructing this within the Jain community: universal application, existing practices, and power and privilege. So universal application, I'm going to revisit the example about vegan initiatives. And let's say Anekantvad is mentioned in trying to stop a Jain center from going fully vegan, or a Jain event, a convention, what have you, um, uh, discussing and debating it, like whether it should be a fully vegan. If, Anekantvad is mentioned to respect non-vegans, what if in the future there is a new movement to respect attendees or members who eat meat? Would Ade conflict still be mentioned? It's very likely, understandable, that this argument of Anekanta would not be applied to that second futuristic, hypothetical. So that does show that it is not universally applied in this example, and likely is sort of a front for injustice against animals at the hands of meat and dairy industry. And so that, I think, is an example to kind of show how you can ask questions, look at the situation, and see if Anekanta is being universally applied or not. The second being existing practices, and this kind of goes to the second prompt that I had asked about Jain organizations or centers commenting on political issues. So Jain centers and community organizations are hosting free of cost medical services and drives for underserved communities. So, would it be warranted for Jains to independently or even within organized community advocate for universal health care policy or universal health coverage at a policy level or a political level? If Anekantavada is invoked to shy away from political commentary, but there is existing practice at a different, maybe a different level or a different sort of manifestation, it can likely be that Anekantavada is being used to ignore debate on political issues such as healthcare access. That is also, a policy matter as well. And lastly is the idea of power and privilege. So, in an era of rising white supremacy, neo-Nazism, and other forms of bigotry, I think this is a very interesting question of, is there a multiplicity of views that have to be respected by Jains of, both sides of this issue? And I think where it comes down to Anekantvad is about respecting diverse viewpoints, and that also must include the protection of that diversity. So when modern versions of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacists, and other forms of hate look to eradicate certain lives, perspectives from marginalized communities, Anekantvad can call Jains, and Jains can engage with it to see, acknowledge, and unequivocally defend marginalized perspectives against bigoted views of eradication and erasure that are often seen through some of these hate movements of power and privilege. So, in conclusion of looking at these three ways of deconstruction, Anekantavad can be engaged with by modern Jains for social justice and confronting views of oppression rather than serving front for neutrality and inaction that furthers injustice. And I hope the three sort of ways that I outlined can sort of be a methodology of dissecting different debates or different sort of dilemmas that Jain communities face, to translate that into very actionable and justice aligned action. And in closing, just Michami Dukram, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And I look forward to the Q&A portion at the end of this. Thank you.